welcome to another episode of the Sant Jordi Festival. I am delighted to welcome Sandra Smith, the longtime translator of Irène Némirovsky, to talk with her about a forthcoming translation she has of an early work by Némirovsky called The Prodigal Child. It's forthcoming by Chaos Press in September. Keep an eye out for it. But in the meantime, Sandra, why don't you tell us a bit about this novella and where it fits in the body of Irène Némirovsky's work?
Well, thanks, Tess. It's really nice to be doing this with you. Yes, it's really a novella. It's a very, very early work. Némirovsky wrote it in about 1923, so she was quite young, early 20s, but it was not published until 1927. And it's a very early work. You can tell by the style that it's very early. It's also one of the few Némirovsky works that's told virtually from a child's perspective, though she does use a child's perspective in parts of a lot of her other novels. The work is set in what was then contemporary Russia, a port town in the Black Sea. And it has a very interesting combination of styles. It's an allegory. It talks about a lot of references to the Old Testament. And it also works as a type of fable, which I found really interesting. So it was a difficult decision what title to use for it, because Némirovsky is very well known for choosing titles that have a multiplicity of meaning in French, and of course it's very difficult in English to choose one, as it were.
And so, well, let's talk about that before you look a little more closely at the novella itself, at the text. What was the biggest hurdle about the title, and how did you solve the problem?
Well, I think I should say also that I've been asked to write the introduction to this publication, which I have not yet written. But one of the reasons that I wanted to write the introduction was to explain this very issue, the choice of the title. And most translators who are either working or watching this, or people who are just interested in translation, will know that every translation is really subjective. We read a work in a foreign language, it hits us in a certain way. It might not strike someone else in the same way. And our reading of the style, the symbolism, the lyricism, all of those elements of a translation become very subjective when you're trying to put it into another language. So it's very common in English to choose a title based on the content of a work rather than a literal translation of the work. The most extreme example that I've had to deal with was something I translated 2 years ago, a novel by Loridan-Ivens, which in French, the literal translation of the title is, "And then you will find the treasure that lies within." The English title chosen by the editor is "Alice Asks the Big Questions."
A little snappier.
So, and I've also recently translated a nonfiction by Anne Sinclair, who's a journalist and a woman who has done a lot of research into her family's history. And it's about a concentration camp outside of Paris, where her grandfather was interned and fortunately survived, but only just, that most people never heard of. The title in French is La Rafle des Notables. Now, when you say to a French person, La Rafle, they automatically they know that it means the roundup of the Jews taken away to concentration camps during the Second World War by the Nazis. I mean, you can't translate that with the same impact that it has in French. And roundup doesn't really do it, because especially here in America, you think of a chemical, you think of weed killer.
Right, or a roundup of a criminal gang. Yeah.
Exactly. So judging by the actual content of the work, we finally came up with the title, In the Shadows of Paris, the Nazi concentration camp that dimmed the city of lights. Because the concentration camp was located very close to Paris, like 50 miles, and no one knew about it. Mm-hmm. So back to this work, in French, the two words, the word for prodigal and prodigy, are very, very close. So you have prodige and prodigue. Mm-hmm. Now, again, knowing Némirovsky, it is about a child prodigy, but there were so many references to the Old Testament and so many similarities in a kind of mirror image way to the prodigal son, that I decided to use the title, The Prodigal Child, so that the reader would automatically and instantly be alerted to the fact that there are biblical references and it is a parable in the same way as the prodigal son.
And there are so many layers in this story, layers of genius, of inspiration, but also of loss and abandonment, that it's impossible to tease the two apart.
Yes, it's that's what I found. Then that's what I found very interesting about it. I mean, clearly not her best work. It's clearly a work of someone who's starting out and learning the craft, but there are still moments of real lyricism in the original, and her love of nature comes through. Nature is virtually a character in a lot of Némirovsky's novels. And the fact that it's told from the perspective of the boy, the protagonist, is also very interesting, because she does do this in some of the other novels, but not to the same extent.
Well, you know, you've described eloquently how to approach a title. With certain texts, the first sentence is as crucial as the first title. And I know that the opening line, the opening sentence, also caused some headaches. So maybe you could talk to us about the new challenges, the challenges that you faced at every step of the way.
Well, as you say, the first two words of the novella are the name of the protagonist, and his name is Ishmael Baruch. Now, Ishmael is almost immediately recognizable from the Old Testament as the quote unquote illegitimate son of Abraham and his handmaiden Hagar, because Sarah, his wife, could not bear children up until, in the Bible, she's about 90, I think. It's a very strange story. So when Sarah does give birth to Isaac, she insists that Hagar and Ishmael be cast out, that they be sent away. And they are cast out. And Ishmael is credited with being a prophet of Islam, if not the founder of Islam. It's kind of ironic, because Abraham and Isaac are the ones who carry on the line of Judaism, along with Sarah. So immediately you get Ishmael, and then Baruch, which perhaps not everyone will know, is a Hebrew word, and it's the Hebrew word for blessed. Many, if not all, Hebrew prayers begin with Baruch atah Adonai, which means blessed are you, Lord our God. Mm-hmm. And so the first two words of the novel start with a paradox. He's cast out, but he's also blessed, which also reverts to that negative, that mirror image I was mentioning before, of the title, The Prodigal Child, because in The Prodigal Son, he leaves of his own accord, and he comes back of his own accord and is welcomed, if not, feted. Whereas in this, he leaves willingly because he's taken in by this magical woman whom he called the princess, which is where the fairy tale element comes in, and goes from being unbelievably poor, and she describes this in great detail, and it's very hard to read, to being extremely wealthy because he has this wonderful gift. And his gift is that he has the inspiration to spontaneously create the most beautiful songs and poetry, which again takes us back to Greek myth, to Orpheus.
Sure.
So there are all of these styles mixed in, and it reminded me a lot of Flaubert, that when you read something like A Simple Heart, where you have a lot of these, different elements coming in and intertwining and overlapping. So it's very interesting. But that's another thing that I have to put into the introduction, is explaining this Ishmael Baruch, his name, and it's a contradiction. And the contradiction is carried out throughout the work, even in terms of his gift, because it's a blessing, but it's also a curse.
Right. Why don't you read a few paragraphs that, to give us a sense of that lyrical style?
Okay. So basically, as I said, he's very poor. He lives in the ghetto. And he starts going to these inns at the port where these kind of seedy characters go every night. But he starts to sing these songs, and they become laments, and people ask him to sing. And he becomes quite famous for his gift. And he meets this gentleman one night whom he calls the Barin. Barin was a Russian title of someone who was a nobleman. And the Barin introduces him to the princess eventually, and that takes the story on. So this is the passage I'll read which I think is so lyrical in French. Because before, she has described all of the village, the town where it is, and the sea, which is very important element as well. The sun streamed down over all these things, and the eternal sea breezes danced joyously in the dust. And when night fell, the bells from the Orthodox Church rang out, calling, echoing, stifling the voice of the call to prayer from the rooftop of the only mosque, whose silent white silhouette softly faded into the night. Ishmael continued singing, and his heart grew lighter, lighter within his chest, like a bird about to take flight. And a strange clarity filled his mind, the kind of clarity that intoxication or delirium sometimes brings. All night long they had him sing. They joined in to sing the refrains that Ishmael discovered in his soul, like treasures placed there by God for all eternity. Never did the boy think about what he would say in advance. Words came to life in him, like mysterious birds to whom he needed only give a little nudge, and the music that accompanied those words came just as naturally. Sometimes he would tilt his head and begin slow, plaintive chants, which these Slavs had never before heard, and which was simply an unconscious echo of the sad Jewish songs that arose from the depths of time, like an immense sob, growing stronger and stronger through the ages until they reached the child's soul.
I think that's a lovely passage, because the lyricism is not just visual and oral, but it's also got a metaphysical element. And you've mentioned, in your introductory remarks, that there is also a fairy tale element. Maybe you could add a passage that gives us a sense of that layer of the text.
Right. Well, he meets this woman named, whom he calls the princess. And in fact, it's quite funny. In one part, she says, "Why do you call me the princess?" And he says, "Aren't you one?" And then she says, "No." And he's, "Well, that doesn't matter." You know, to him, she's the princess. And it's kind of a rags to riches story for the boy, because she's fabulously wealthy. And she takes him from his family with their agreement, and for a large sum of money, I might add, so that she can take over his education and cultivate him, because she wants to be the patron of this genius, of this boy wonder. I mean, at the time, he's only about 12. The story goes from about age 12 to about 15. Okay. So she takes him to her estate with this amazing mansion, and he has to get used to all of these things, which does not take him very long. I'll read this little bit for you. A silent and serious Ishmael walked through the estate and the rooms of the mansion. They were decorated with tapestries and mirrors painted with birds and flowers in the Italian style. The princess, enthralled, saw that he was very much at ease amongst all these things that to him were more extraordinary than visions of paradise. And when he'd been bathed, had his hair styled, and dressed like a little lord in a velvet suit with a large pointed lace collar, he suddenly resembled a portrait by Van Dyck, a graceful child with long curls. He very quickly adapted to his new life. So he does get used to this very quickly.
Yes, and it does have that magical aura about it. We want to not give too much away, but also maybe draw the potential readers in a little bit more. So where does the story, or where does Ishmael's story begin to go wrong?
Well, it's not absolutely clear in the novella. The catalyst seems to be when he falls in love with the princess. He absolutely worships her. But he gets very ill and is ill for weeks and weeks, and I think he's going to die, but he doesn't die.
So a good pandemic novella.
Yes, it's a good pandemic. And when he recovers, he's sent to another estate that she owns, and he's all alone. It's winter, and he's all alone. She's gone to Italy for the winter. And there's a library with these great classical authors. This is very much Némirovsky's own real story as well. She read voraciously as a child. She spoke, well, French was really her first language, because at the time when she was born in Kiev, French was considered the language of the upper classes. And she had a French governess whom she adored. So she learned French before Russian, spoke Russian. She also spoke English. She knew some German. And then when they fled it was in 1917, the Russian Revolution, she spent a year in Finland and learned Finnish, and then in Sweden and learned Swedish. So she was, she had a lot of languages, and she read in a lot of languages. That was something else that sort of I wondered about with the Ishmael as well. I wondered if Moby Dick, had come into it at all. The first line, call me Ishmael. Anyway, so back to the princess. It seems that his losing his inability to create these beautiful songs and poems coincides with him falling in love with her, but also being ill and also starting to read the great classical authors, of course, to whom he had not all been exposed before. but now he's by himself and he has this library. So I'll read you this little bit. He loved the princess with all his heart, with the feverish, ardent little heart of a prodigal child. As for the books, they made him jealous and unhappy. Unconsciously, he started imitating the verses of others. When that happened, a kind of hateful rage surged through him. His former songs seemed laughable to him, pitiful. Up until now, he had looked at nature and people with his own eyes and translated what they meant to him very quietly through his own words. But now, suddenly, the distorting, perfidious mirror reflecting the soul of other people slipped in between the outside world and his own soul. There were poems that he couldn't speak out loud without weeping, and others that filled him with an emotion that was almost like terror. And when he remembered his songs, they seemed so pitiful, so awkward, so inept and foolish, that he felt infinitely ashamed, humiliated, and miserable. So it turns quite sad, really.
Yeah, but it's also, it forms an interesting exploration of the mysteries of inspiration and creation. It seems that there's also a certain loss of naivete that brings, that lames, makes his, that stifles him, makes him too self-conscious to continue. We are out of time, I'm afraid, but I hope that this sense of, that we've enticed the readers and the audience into this mysterious and unsettling text. So Sandra, thank you. Looking very much.
And thank you, Tess. And I'd like to thank Kenneth Kales also for allowing us to do this kind of sneak preview of the work and for giving me the opportunity to translate this, and also all the organizers and people who work so hard for St. Geordie, especially Mary Ann.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for your celebration of literature.
Thanks a lot, Tess. Thanks so much for doing this.